Hello viewers, welcome to the Bachelor's course of Population Studies. Today we will discuss about the global distribution of poverty. Poverty is a condition where people's basic needs for food, clothing, shelter, education and basic health requirements are not being met. It is the inability to get the minimum consumption requirements of life. When these minimum human needs are not fulfilled, there is a loss of health and efficiency. According to Oxford Dictionary of Sociology, poverty is a state in which resources, usually material but sometimes cultural, are lacking. It is generally determined by the standards that exist within a society. Its measurement differs from place to place and from time to time. This is why sociologists define it either in absolute or relative terms. Poverty is generally of two types, absolute poverty and relative poverty. Absolute poverty is synonymous with the destitution and it occurs when people cannot obtain adequate resources, and these resources are measured in terms of calories or nutrition to support a minimum level of physical health. It is defined in the context of per capita intake of calories and minimum level of per capita consumption expenditure. There are two criteria for this. Calorie criteria. In this, the energy that an individual gets from the food that he eats every day is measured in terms of calories. In India, according to Planning Commission, an individual in rural areas must get 2400 calories and in urban areas 2100 calories per day. The second criteria is minimum consumption expenditure criteria. As per the expert committee appointed by Planning Commission, those people will be treated as living below the poverty line whose per capita consumption expenditure according to 68th survey of NSSO at 2011-12 price level is rupees 816 per capita per month in rural areas and rupees 1000 per capita per month in urban areas. The second type of poverty is relative poverty. It is the condition in which people lack the minimum amount of income needed in order to maintain the average standard of living in the society in which they live. Relative poverty is considered the easiest way to measure the level of poverty in an individual country. Relative poverty is defined relative to the members of society and therefore differs across countries. It occurs when people do not enjoy a certain minimum level of living standard as determined by a government. Relative poverty also changes over time. As the wealth of a society increases, so does the amount of income and resources that the society deems necessary for proper conditions of living. Many countries over the last decade in particular have gotten much better off in average income. But poverty hasn't fallen as much as one might expect or hope. All of this speaks a lot of the current debates about the rising importance of inequality around the world. One of the Millennium Development Goals calls for eradicating extreme poverty and hunger by the year 2015. The United Nations has said that global economic crisis of recent years has slowed down the progress. Since the crisis, it is said, more workers find themselves and their families living in extreme poverty. The United Nations has defined absolute poverty as a condition characterized by severe deprivation of basic human needs, including food, safe drinking water, sanitation facilities, health, shelter, education and information. It depends not only on income but also on an excess of services. The United Nations definition of overall poverty includes ill health, lack of access to education and other basic services, inadequate housing, unsafe environments, social discrimination and exclusion. The population below poverty line is unable to meet the minimum human needs. This requires minimum income to buy necessities of life, and this varies from society to society and time to time. Then there is a question, what is the standard poverty line below which absolute poverty exists? This is again a problematic question because poverty line and its criteria of determination differs from place to place and time to time. A common method used to measure poverty line is based on the income or consumption levels. In India, for the year 2011-12, the poverty line for a person was fixed at rupees 816 per month for the rural areas and rupees 1000 for urban areas. However, for making comparisons between developing countries, World Bank uses a uniform standard for the poverty line, that is minimum availability of the equivalent of $1.25 per person per day. Let's see the trends of different regions of the developing world performing in terms of extreme poverty reduction. As shown in the figure on the screen, extreme poverty headcount rates have fallen in every developing region in the last 3 decades. That is the decades in which we were developing. After steadily increasing from 51% in 1981 to 58% in 1999, the extreme poverty rate fell 10 percentage points in sub-Saharan Africa between 1999 to 2010 and is now 48%, an impressive decline of 17% in one single decade. In Latin America and Caribbean, that is LAC, after remaining stable at approximately 12% for the last 2 decades of the 20th century, extreme poverty was cut in half between the year 1999 and 2010, and as shown in the figure, it's now at 6%. Poverty rates have fallen in all the regions of the world, except in sub-Saharan Africa, where the number of poor individuals has risen steadily and dramatically between 1981 and 2010. There were more than twice as many extremely poor people living in sub-Saharan Africa in 2010, that is 414 million, than there were 3 decades ago. It was just 205 million. Figure 2 presents the global trends that show that while the extreme poor in sub-Saharan Africa represented only 11% of the world's total in 1981, they now account for more than a third of the world's extreme poor. India contributes another third, up from 22% in 1981. And then comes China. China comes next, contributing 13%, down from 43% in 1981. Isn't it amazing? But this share has increased substantially in case of India since 1981. That is, from 22% it has gone up to 33% in 2010. Figure 3 shows the regional shares of the world's extreme poor population. How poor are the extremely poor? Have they become poorer in the last 3 decades? The figure plots the average daily per capita income of the extremely poor in the developing world as a whole, in the sub-Saharan African region and in the developing world excluding sub-Saharan Africa. As shown, the average income of the extremely poor in the developing world has been rising and steadily converging to the set amount, that is $1.25 per day poverty line. In 2010, the average income of the extremely poor in the developing world was 87 cents per capita per day, up from 74% in 1981. If the extreme poor in sub-Saharan Africa were not included, then the average income of the world's poor would have converged even faster to the $1.25 line, as shown in figure 4. This increase in incomes of the extreme poor is unfortunately not seen in sub-Saharan Africa. Between 1981 and 2010, the average income of the extremely poor has remained flat at approximately half of the $1.25 line in that region. Figure 4 shows the evolution of average per capita income of the extremely poor. Where is extreme poverty deepest and therefore hardest to end? There are approximately 400 million and 500 million extreme poor people in these regions respectively. And this extreme poverty reduction is a huge challenge in both sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. The depth of extreme poverty is commonly measured by the extreme poverty gap. When expressed in dollars based on purchasing power parity calculations, the extreme poverty gap represents the average amount of additional daily income needed by the extremely poor to reach the poverty line of $1.25 per day. Thus, from this figure we can see that the average gap of the extremely poor in the world is 38 cents per day, or approximately $140 per year in 2005 at purchasing power parity dollars. Since there are 1.2 billion extremely poor individuals in the world, the aggregate global extreme poverty gap amounts to approximately $169 billion in 2005 purchasing power parity dollars, or approximately $197 billion in 2010. That is, if the incomes of every extremely poor person was to rise to the $1.25 line, the aggregate increase in their income would need to total at least $169 billion in 2005 purchasing power parity terms. We call this number the aggregate extreme poverty gap. This represents approximately 0.25% of global GDP. It is important to note that extreme poverty gap is the conceptual amount of direct additional income an average extremely poor person would need to get $1.25 per day. And it is not an indicative of the level of assistance required to close the gap. But interestingly, this gap is reduced over the years. The aggregate global extreme poverty gap in 2010 was less than half the gap in 1981. That is from $362 billion in 2005 PPP terms, a faster reduction than the reduction in the number of poor. According to United Nations estimates, half of the world's poor live in India and China. 1/4 live in heavily populated middle income countries such as Nigeria, Pakistan, Indonesia. The rest are in low income countries. The concept of multidimensional poverty needs to be discussed here. Let's discuss the concept of multidimensional poverty and some key facts about it. Like development, poverty is also multidimensional. The Multidimensional Poverty Index, that is MPI, published for the first time in 2010 report. The index identifies deprivations across the same three dimensions as the Human Development Index and shows the number of people who are multidimensionally poor, suffering deprivations in 33% of weighted indicators, and the number of deprivations with which poor households typically contend with. The Multidimensional Poverty Index can be adapted to the national level using indicators and weights that makes sense for the region or the country. It can be adopted for national poverty eradication programs and it can be used to study changes over time. Almost 1.5 billion people in the 91 countries covered by MPI, more than a third of their population live in multidimensional poverty. That is, with at least 33% of the indicators reflecting acute deprivation in health, education and standard of living. This exceeds the estimated 1.2 billion people in those countries who live on $1.25 a day or less. And close to 800 million people are vulnerable to fall into poverty if setbacks occur. Any kind of setback may be financial, natural or otherwise. According to global poverty statistics for 2013, nearly half of the world's population, that's more than 3 billion people, can live on less than $2.50 a day. More than 1.3 billion live in extreme poverty. That means they live in less than $1.25 a day. As of 2013, according to United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, there are roughly 870 million people on the planet who suffer from chronic malnutrition. This is a large part of what makes up global poverty, and it's a matter of concern. This means that 1 in 8 people suffer from not having enough food to eat. According to global poverty statistics from UNICEF, 1 billion children in the world today are facing extreme global poverty, and 22,000 will die each day due to the impoverished conditions of their countries. Due to the global poverty, many children and their families cannot afford vaccinations that would fight off and prevent diseases. This means thousands, if not millions, of children will die this year alone due to preventable causes such as malaria, polio or maybe hunger. According to poverty facts, 1.6 billion people or a quarter of the entire world's population lives without electricity, in addition to facing extreme poverty and hardship. Let's discuss some key findings about multidimensional poverty across the globe. Countries that fall into the same income category can have quite different poverty levels. Among upper middle income countries, the percentage of multidimensional poverty ranges from almost nil in Belarus to 39.6% in Namibia. Among lower middle income countries, it ranges from 0.8% in Georgia to 68.1% in Timor-Leste. Among low income countries, it ranges from 4.9% in Kazakhstan to 92.4% in Niger. Multidimensionally poor people are heavily concentrated in a relatively small number of 10 to 20 populous countries. Over 80% live in 10 countries and over 90% live in just 20 countries. Indeed, 40% live in a single country. Can you imagine which this country is? It's India. 40% people with multidimensional poverty live in India. There are some surprising levels of severe multidimensional poverty in a number of middle income countries, typically up to a quarter or a third of the population. In the case of countries such as India, where 28.6%, Nigeria 33.9%, Pakistan 27.4%, Cote d'Ivoire 39.3% and Yemen 31.9%. Rates of severe multidimensional poverty are, however, higher in lower income countries, with highest rate in Ethiopia 72% and Niger with 82%. Close to 3/4 of multidimensionally poor people and over 2/3 of people in severe multidimensional poverty live in middle income countries. There are 1.56 billion multidimensionally poor people across 83 countries, of whom just over a billion live in middle income countries and 0.42 billion live in lower income countries. There are 830 million people in severe multidimensional poverty, of whom over 560 million live in middle income countries and over 260 million live in lower income countries. What are the causes? What can be the causes of this global poverty? Though the causes of poverty vary from country to country and region to region, the global causes of poverty can be divided as acute causes and entrenched factors. Acute causes of poverty. These can be natural disaster. Natural disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes have devastated communities throughout the world. Developing countries often suffer much more extensive and acute crises at the hands of natural disorders because limited resources inhibit the construction of adequate housing, infrastructure, and mechanisms for responding to crisis. Other reasons can be warfare. The material and human destruction caused by warfare is a major development problem. For example, from 1990 to 93, the period encompassing Desert Storm, per capita GDP in Iraq fell from $3,500 to $761. Another reason is agricultural cycles. Those who produce for household food consumption, that is subsistence farming, often go through cycles of relatively abundance and scarcity. For many families that rely on subsistence production for survival, the period immediately prior to harvest is a hungry period. During these periods of scarcity, many families lack sufficient resources to meet their minimum nutritional needs. Another reason is droughts and floods. Besides the immediate destruction caused by natural calamities such as hurricanes, environmental forces often cause acute periods of crisis by destroying crops, animals, and human life. Let's discuss the entrenched factors associated with poverty. Colonial histories. One of the most important barriers to development in poor countries is lack of uniform basic infrastructure such as roads and means of communication. It has been established by development scholars that colonial history is an important contributor to the current situation. In most countries with a history of colonization, the colonizers developed local economies to facilitate the expropriation of resources for their own economic growth and development. On the other hand, they exploited the host countries. Another reason is centralization of power. Disproportional centralized system in developing countries is also a cause of poverty. In this system, one major party, politician or region is responsible for decision making throughout the country. This often causes development problems. Corruption is one of the major factors that adds to poverty. Corruption often accompanies centralization of power when leaders are not accountable to those they serve. Most directly, corruption inhibits development when leaders help themselves to money that would otherwise be used for development projects. In other cases, leaders reward political support by providing services to their followers. Warfare. Warfare also contributes to more entrenched poverty by diverting scarce resources from fighting poverty to maintaining military. Take for example the cases of Ethiopia and Eritrea. The conflict over borders between the two countries erupted into war during 1999 and 2000, a period when both countries faced severe food shortages due to drought. Environmental degradation can be another reason for poverty. Though awareness about environmental degradation has grown in the last few decades, the negative impacts of environmental degradation are still disproportionately felt by the poor. Throughout the developing world, the poor often rely on natural resources to meet their basic needs through agricultural production and gathering resources essential for household maintenance such as water, firewood, wild plants for consumption and medicine. Thus, the depletion and contamination of water sources directly threaten the livelihoods of those who depend upon them. What should be then done to overcome global poverty? There are few steps which can help in reduction of global poverty. These are removal of social inequality. Social inequality is based on the cultural ideas about the relative worth of different genders, races, ethnic groups and social classes. Due to social inequality, the underprivileged sections of the society remain poor. Spread of education is the best way to fight the evil of social inequality. Then we can overcome poverty by controlling corruption. Corruption has become very common both in government and private sector. Businesses should enact, publicize and follow codes of conduct banning corruption on the part of their staff and directors. Citizens must demand greater transparency on the part of both government and the corporate sector and create reform movements wherever needed. There should be broadened access to education and technology among marginalized groups and especially among the girls and women. The educational attainment of women has strong bearing on the well-being of their families, and efforts to improve education for women and girls must be strengthened. At the same time, steps should be taken to ensure that the current revolution in information technology benefits marginalized groups. This must begin in school. We should also improve government capacity to provide universal access to essential goods and services, including potable water, affordable food, primary health care, education, housing and other social services. Governments around the world have made commitments to this through the 2020 initiative, which calls for 20% of the national budgets and 20% of foreign aid to be spent on human services, but raising adequate sources through effective taxation and other mechanisms is often politically difficult. New mechanisms for public policy must be put in place. Non-profit groups and even corporations can provide essential support. These non-governmental actors can also help in the actual provision of services. To sum up, we can say that worldwide experience shows that with development, the definition of poverty has also changed. In this module, we have seen that poverty is a multi-dimensional concept which is normally measured through poverty line. The challenge of poverty eradication is becoming bigger as this concept, as scholars are broadening the concept into human poverty. That's all with today's lecture. I hope this must have added to your knowledge. Next time I'll come with a new topic. Till then, have a nice time. Bye-bye.